Yeah, I'm really grateful to be here. It's good to see all of you. We're starting a new series, Life Poetica, we called it. Finding meaning in the everyday. This series came out of a conversation really between me and David Dean and Leslie too. I think was a part of it. Um, and one of the things that David was saying, which sort of struck me, was we all have a attraction to story and really to meaning making. And whether it's books or novels or poems, it depends on what you're into. Movies, like they're alluring. They're alluring in their capacity to tell a story and to suck us into a particular story. In some ways, the power of that is in the fact that it mirrors back a kind of question to us, which is, what is the meaning of your own life? Sometimes, we need to look for it somewhere else before sort of it gets reversed and it turns back in on itself, and we wonder, what is our story? What is the meaning of my own life, my own existence, and also my ordinary sort of everyday waking life, the choices that I make on a sort of day-to-day basis. So that's what we want to explore for the month of July, and we'll do it in different ways. I've got several teachings lined up, and then our guests will come in and speak to it in their own sort of unique voice. And let me pitch something to you. I think C3 is great. I mean, it's an amazing, just an example being the voices that we've already heard this morning speaking in their own way, um, and speaking really profound and sort of inspiring things into the community. It's the voice of the community coming alive. And you too can be a part of it. You can get a name tag. I mean, this means now I'm legitimate. It says Kent Dobson. You too can have a name tag. We just need a DNA sample, and we can, make sure you're good to go. But one of the gifts of C3 is that we hand over sort of meaning making, if you want to take that as the theme for the month, hand it over to the community and to what's happening in the world and to what's happening on Saturday with these signs and Sunday. And so anyway, all that to pitch, you too can have ideas that shape the Sunday morning and the content. I don't just go into some sort of closet and lock the door and, and Moses or God or something tells me what to say. It comes out of a conversation. And July 9th, you can join this conversation. This is a little pitch for the bulletin. Read the bulletin. July 9th, we'll have a little round table. I used to have like a standing Monday lunch. Anyone that wants to come, I want to open that up to a larger conversation, a round table around what do you want to talk about on Sundays? What are themes, ideas, pressing concerns that you think would be wonderful if we could find our way into it? So that's a little bit of a pitch, but also just acknowledging that the truths we are seeking come in sort of many voices. So that's how I wanted to start. What else do I want to say? Speaking of story, when I was a kid, I grew up in fundamentalist Baptist culture, and the thing that was the ultimate was the testimony, the personal testimony. So every sort of like gathering, youth group, revival, I don't know if you're ever familiar with that term. The revival is when they guilt everybody into getting saved again. But anyway, the pinnacle of that was always someone giving their personal testimony. And some of them were awesome. And even now that I no longer have that same worldview, I think actually many of these stories, there was something quite compelling about them. Something happened to this person. And then in the telling of that something, well, it was sort of meant to inspire us or guilt us or shame us. That also was happening. But that's intriguing to me. The telling of a story, giving a testimony. Now, of course, like, the more dramatic, the better. That's the way I took it as a kid. Like, if you were on drugs and, you lost everything and, you're just about on your deathbed and you roll over in your hotel room and there's a Gideon Bible there and you open it and all of a sudden, the lights come on and you change your life. That counted like as a real testimony. But when you're a kid, you feel like I felt at least, well, I don't really have a story, It doesn't count to say, hey, why are you a Christian? Well, because I don't know anybody who's not. and everybody tells me I have to do this thing, you know? That's not like a riveting testimony. So I grew up with this sort of like weird relationship with sort of the drama of it all. And of course, probably is like rooted in maybe St. Paul's dramatic conversion story. I use that in quotation marks as sort of a scholar, but yeah, this where the road to Damascus, where Jesus, speaks to Paul and he changes his life. And then when I got to college, I also went to a Christian college, and we had this class called GNED. I have no idea what the acronym stands for. And it was basically like Intro to Christianity. And as part of the class, you had to write your testimony, which I thought was funny. You also had to write your testimony to get into the school, which is also kind of funny. But the thing with Liberty University, where I went to school, which I feel like I'm just like coming out of the closet or something. I went to Liberty University. This is Jerry Falwell's school. You can fire me after the teaching's done. That's fine. It's no problem. Anyway, as part of the class, we had to write our testimony. But the thing with Liberty is that it was also NCAA Division I athletics, and so the way to remain Division I is to be good at athletics. And so they had to recruit people, and the pool of devout Christian athletes is kind of small. So they bent the rules a bit. And so I was on the soccer team, and there were lots of kids on the soccer team who were sort of Christian, maybe just in the loosest sense of the term. And in fact, one of my friends, Mark, he was from England. So they were like, "Hey, do you want to play soccer for us?" "Yeah, sure, that sounds good. Are you a Christian?" He's like any English bloke, "I suppose so." Anyway, so he comes and he arrives and he's in this class, and we get to the place where we're supposed to write our testimony. He's like, "What's a testimony?" So the soccer team got together and sort of like helped him manufacture this personal testimony so he could pass the class, of course. Just so weird. And actually, it reminded me of another story. When I lived in Israel, there was a friend of mine, his name was Phil, got up I was part of this little church, actually not too unlike C3, except a little bit more religious, very communal and sort of awesome and small place. And anyway, my friend Phil was giving this talk on Shabbat. We met on the Sabbath because Sunday's a work day in Israel. And anyway, he got up and told this story where he was falling in love with this girl, and he was like, "Man, this could really be it." And he went to go visit her family, and her family was like, "You need to give your testimony." And so he like kind of panicked and more or less invented this awesome and dramatic testimony, and it became like the thing, like this is the guy with the dramatic testimony, and therefore is also eligible to marry our daughter. And it took him like many years to sort of own up to the fact that it wasn't a real testimony. He actually called it his testaphony, which I thought was like pretty good. Which is funny because now that I'm thinking about it, the actual telling of the testaphony became like the testimony, the real story. Like, actually, the story is I made this up. And the story of making up has shaped my life in a certain way. So that's kind of like, believe it, what did I call my talk this week? I want to talk about meaning, myth, and testimony. So in some ways, I want to talk about testimony. What is the story of your life? What is the truth of your own life? What are the patterns that keep showing up? Some you don't like, some maybe you do. And how do you make sense of it? What kernel or truth, what unique kernel of truth that sort of rests only in you, that only you can embody? These are not easy things to name. They're really not. If your life is a poem, like David Dean was beautifully describing, what are the stanzas? What does it consist of? Is it full of contradictions? Like I thought of Walt Whitman as you were speaking. Do I contradict myself? I contain multitudes. So what are the stanzas? How would you phrase it? Or is it just not worth it? I'll just hand over meaning making to somebody else, to some other group or clan or way of putting things, sort of hand the baton off. Or I'll project it out onto movies and books that I like and say it's all over there. So those are the things I want us to be thinking about, not just today, but for the whole month, when it comes to a life poetica, it's not just what happened. Because what happened matters. Like, what are the facts? You say, just give me the facts of your life. That does matter, but what do they mean? Is sort of starting to take a different turn. What does that mean? Does your life have meaning in that sense? And actually, as I'm thinking about sort of meaning making, and maybe just an observation or an assumption I have, I think human beings are meaning making creatures. It's part of consciousness, as far as we can tell. From the oldest cave paintings in France to stabbing a flag on the moon, if that really happened. I think it did. Well, what do I know? I wasn't there. But that's not just like, those are facts that we did stuff. Those are attempts at meaning. What does it mean to be a human being? What's it mean to be alive? What's it mean to be conscious of our own mortality in a way that apparently other creatures are not? What does that mean? So I took a class at Hebrew University where I went to graduate school, and the class was on conversion. The whole class. That was the title of the class, Conversion. I thought, I'm going to take that class. It was kind of an experimental class. It was taught by two professors. And we studied all kinds of conversion stories, like from St. Augustine to Pulp Fiction. So it was like this wild ride through all kinds of accounts, and also all the sociology that gets wrapped up with a question like, what is conversion? It's actually very hard to even get at the nature of that question. One of the things I learned in this conversion class was from some sociologists who had been doing some writing on it. And they had done like sort of a long-term sort of investigation into cults and into sort of fundamentalism and things like this. And they said one of the observations that the scholar had, she said that one of the things that seems obvious with these conversion stories is that you convert to a certain way of talking about conversion, which is a very sort of clever, scholarly thing to say, but there's a lot of truth to it. Because you have the story of your own life, correct? Something happened to you. But how you talk about that is pretty critical, both in terms of how you're understanding it and how the group is understanding it. And so as they track these people, these conversion stories, sure enough, whatever happened was whatever happened, but how they talked about it was a way of converting to talking about it in a certain way. Which sort of like always stuck in the back of my mind as like, that is curious. Is that all there is? Is that we simply just convert to a way of talking about it. So you convert to a way of talking about being a Baptist, or you convert to a way of talking about being a progressive. Is that all it is? Sort of group conformity? Or is there something else? So I want to talk about meaning making in that sense in sort of two respects first. I do think, maybe this is first half of life, maybe as you were saying, whatever happened before the age of 26 and then after the age of 26, to refer to your song there. I think that it is true that as we grow up, and I'm thinking maybe adolescence, part of growing up is learning a certain measure of conformity. How do I fit into this or that group? And how do I know if I fit into this or that group? I have to talk about fitting into this or that group in a way that this or that group says, you're one of us. And you get a name tag and they take your DNA. I'm not minimizing that, and I'm not actually saying that that can be avoided. I don't think it can be avoided. Because you grow up and you suddenly become aware, what group do I fit in? How do I fit in? And how do I talk about it? How do I sort of, be one of the fill in the blank? And I think that is a critical dimension of meaning making. Your life starts to have some meaning as you slide into that group. But we also know that whatever the group is can also be a major limiter if you want to keep growing up. Correct? Suddenly, certain ways of saying things, you can't talk like that. Like when we were helping Mark craft his testimony, he couldn't just go off the rails and talk. He had to stay within the borders and boundaries that made sense so he could get the grade. Well, that's happening on an unconscious level when it comes to sort of group identity. Like imagine if I had this awesome testimony where I was a drug addict and I had lost all my money and I was had just woken up from being passed out in a hotel room in LA, and I roll over and I open the drawer and there's a Gideon Bible, and I open the Bible and it says, "For God so loved the world." I'm like, oh my word, Jesus, he's going to save my life. And he does. And I sit up in bed, and then Muhammad comes in and says, oh, there's also another prophet. Like, let's say that happened. I can't tell that conversion story to a group of Christians, correct? I wouldn't be accepted. I maybe could tell that conversion story to Muslims. I don't know. Do you see what I'm saying about how we shape things? Anyway, that's number one. There's a kind of conversion to the group which looks a lot like conformity. Handing over the meaning of our life to the group. Except it doesn't last all that long for most of us. Which I'd like to suggest there's something else. There's another sort of meaning-making map out there, and that is finding meaning in a far more radical and unique sense, what I would call the realm of the soul. What is your soul? What is the radical root of who you are? And as I'm saying it now, radical means root. That's the etymology of the word. It means root, rooted somewhere. Actually, to be a radical is to be rooted. Rooted in what? Well, one's own soul. That's what makes radicals not fit into a group. They're rooted in a sense of who they are. They don't need other people to tell them, make sure you talk about your testimony in a certain acceptable way. They stop doing that at a certain point and become a radical. And all that means is they're rooted somewhere. And what are they rooted in? The truth of their own life. They're going further on the path of meaning making. What is the meaning and the truth of my own existence? And do I have the courage to follow such a thing? Do I have the courage to follow the trails that begin to appear? So if I had to guess, and let's talk about culture just a little bit. If I had to guess, I think one of the most pressing and radical problems facing being a modern person in the 21st century is a loss of meaning. I really do think that. A loss of meaning. Our culture seems to have lost so much meaning. It's a cultural thing and it's a personal thing. It's epidemic at this point. And part of the reason why it's epidemic is because our major stories are unraveling. The stories that hold cultures together and people groups together and religions together and ethnicities together are unraveling. We're in a postmodern muck of things. And I'm not saying that in either a good or a bad sense. I'm just saying it seems to be the case. And if you haven't noticed, there are major competing narratives for what does it mean to be an American right now. Major competing narratives. And it gives you a sense, sort of existential sense, what is the meaning of all this? What is the meaning? Not to mention, sort of also in a personal sense, what is the meaning of my own life? I think our collective myths and narratives and religions, if I can just put it in a simple sense, the big patterns don't seem to be cutting it anymore. They don't seem to be sort of laying it down with a sense of certainty. And that creates problems. Creates problems for the big patterns of our own life. I found this quotation, sort of in the absence of myths, religions, and big narratives. I'm laughing because it's kind of dark. James Hillman has this awesome quote. You ready for this? The only God left that is truly universal, omnipresent, omnipotent, observed faithfully in thought and action, joining all humankind in daily acts of devotion is, would you like to know? You're close. He says the economy. The economy. Listen to this. That's the God we nourish with actual human blood. Yeah. And I think one part of us knows this is true, and it doesn't sit right. And I don't care what political spectrum you're on, something doesn't sit right. Is that the meaning of life? The economy in which we feed children to get objects to make our lives more brand friendly or something? So that's what I mean. The big stories are unraveling. And even our gods, our gods are looking more like the economy than the ones that ask questions of depth. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, individually, I think we also struggle with a sense of what is the meaning of my life individually? I don't know if you saw the statistics that came out from the CDC that sort of got buried in the news with all the other drama that was going on about the rates of suicide. That in every age group, they're going up. Every age group. You know? I look for symbols. And I kept thinking about the symbol of a wall, of a border wall. Like, let's put up a wall so that no one could get in. But what's inside is a lot of sickness. You know? Don't come in here. But inside, where we've locked ourselves in a place that feels rather hopeless and meaningless at its worst. Not always. But and you see that unfolding with these statistics. And our celebrities too. Like this past year, just think of how many. We had Anthony Bourdain and Kate Spade just recently, and before that, Chris Cornell. Chris Cornell was a real hero for me. He was the lead singer of Soundgarden. So Soundgarden for me, 16 years old, riding in my friend Derek's. He had a Jimmy. Remember those GMC Jimmys? The top could come off the back. Oh, we would just rock the Soundgarden. I'm going to break my rusty cage and run. And by the way, yeah, what a song. Anyway, and Chris Cornell he went through sort of the worst of the worst, like addiction and then making it out of the 90s, like when you're a 90s grunge band and then all of a sudden another era of music takes over, next thing you know, you're playing a show in Vegas. Somehow he made it even past that, still making music and still being a creative artist in the world. And he has one of the most incredible voices, or had one of the most incredible voices in modern music. And he still took his own life, Think, man, this is what's going on inside our border walls. So a crisis of meaning, yeah, I think we're in a crisis of meaning, both sort of culturally and personally. Where's that? Oh, it's probably here. Listen to this quotation from Jung here. This is maybe moving toward the more personal side of things. Here's Jung. He said, I asked myself, what is the myth you are living? What a question. What is the myth you are living? And I found I did not know. This is from the Red Book, by the way. So I took it upon myself to get to know my myth, which he puts in quotation marks, my myth. And I regard this as the task of tasks. So instead of just swimming in a sea of nihilism or narcissism or meaninglessness, Jung starts to swim for the shore of the meaning of his own life. What is it? What is the meaning of your own life? What is the myth that you are living? And I think by myth here, he means the meaning-making maps. Sometimes when people say that's a myth, they mean it's not true. When I mean it if that's a myth, there's something true there. It just might not be factual, the way we add things up. Myth is a kind of meaning-making map. What myth are you living? And how would you go about finding out? How would you go about finding out? If I were to give you a homework assignment, like, what is the myth you are living? How would you go about finding out? I wanted to start with that Shakespeare quote, "All the world's a stage and all the men and women merely players," because it also reminds me of something else that James Hollis says, which is the only recurring character in your life is you. The only one that's in every scene is you, like it or not. And I realize there's been some blocking, like, I mean, in the how you block out a play. There's been some blocking. We call that fate. You know, you didn't choose your parents. You didn't choose your ethnicity. You didn't choose your geography. That's the blocking. But there's a lot of improv involved. But the only thing you can't get out of is that you're in every scene. All right? So what is the myth of your own life? What is the story that you are both trying to understand and also craft at the same time? This week I was thinking about an ancient practice, which I think is very inspiring in a way, and it's you find it among several different cultures in various forms, and it's called the Death Lodge. Come to C3, we can talk about the Death Lodge. The Death Lodge is very simple. When it comes time for you to die, you would sit in your Death Lodge, and you would try to put the world to rights as best you could. Telling stories, writing letters to people, organizing your affairs, picking up the loose ends that you feel need to be addressed. People coming to visit you, they've come to visit the person who's in the Death Lodge. So if you were to imagine such a scene, what? In other words, the Death Lodge is a symbol for what is the meaning of my own life? What is the meaning of my own life? And am I going to look at that and face that? And is there anything worth passing on? You know, is there any way of speaking about what I've come to know about myself and about the world that needs to be communicated before it's too late? That's the notion of the Death Lodge. I think that's such a powerful reminder, first of all, of our own mortality. In fact, probably consciousness of our own mortality is the very thing that ratchets up the desire for meaning. Correct? You only get one shot, to quote Eminem or whatever. You only get one shot, and you know that, and so therefore comes this sort of insatiable desire for meaning. What does it mean? You know, if you're in your Death Lodge, are you going to cling to your testimonies? Or is your life a testimony? And you say, no, this is as best I can tell the truth of my own life, and I'm going to let go of some of those testimonies. They need to be rewritten. I'm going to talk about that next week a little bit, but just a little bit of a hint. Sometimes, if we're very, in a very subtle way, even the stories that we think are major identity forming stories in our life, if you listen to how you talk about them over time, if you're a person that's growing, you end up talking about them differently. Letting go of certain ways of like, oh, that actually doesn't ring true anymore. It's like when I was finally done writing my book, I was like, if I were to start over, I wouldn't say it this way. But, you know, you have deadlines, so you have to give up. This is the best I can put it now, but I have to hold even that loosely. So we keep saying around here that in one way, shape, or form, this may be the tagline of C3, the unexamined life is not worth living, right? So what are the patterns, the memories, the failures, the ideas, the relationships, the loves, the losses, the tastes, what you enjoy, your ordinary delights, what you're feeling around children or dogs or gardens or sunsets or adventures, the everyday happenings. The everyday happenings. Where else are you going to look? You're the only recurring character, and you're in every scene, and every scene matters. Where else are you going to look for these kinds of things? So here's my challenge. This is why I'm giving you like a challenge, homework assignment. For this month, since we're going to keep talking about this, what if you found your own way into sort of rethinking this? What is the myth of my own life? What is the story of my own life? What are the patterns? How would I talk about it? In other words, I'm sort of asking you, if you were to make a kind of memoir in whatever way, shape, or form, not to be published, although if you want to do that, that's fine too. I'm sure we'll all buy it. Um, but what would I say? What would I say if I'm laying there in the death lodge and I'm writing things out? What would I say? How would I speak about it? How would I speak about my own life? What needs to be re-examined? And what of my ordinary life is sucking me further into the question of meaning? What if you said what happened, or another way of saying what is happening, and you also tried to say, and what does it mean? What does it mean? It's not so easy. But I think it's deep. I think it rests deep in the soul, deep in the very essence of being a human being. To be this meaning-making self for whatever reason. I don't know. I didn't create all this. So in this world with its invitation, I think. And I think to start to ask questions is to be on the soul path. And I don't think it's a selfish act. It can sound a bit selfish, what does it mean in my life? But I think the more you have contact with that, the easier it is you're able to speak into the meaninglessness and meanings of the culture around us. If you don't know who you are, how are you supposed to interact with all these competing narratives and the things that are dominating, this is who you are? Trying to impose that in some way. One of the great gifts that I've received since being here is actually meeting so many of you. And I'm thinking particularly of these little standing lunches that I had for a while, where people would come in and I basically wanted to know, how did you end up here? But what was I really asking? Like, what's your story? And that was what I found so compelling. And I thought, this is an interesting place. This is an interesting place. People have some wildly diverse and interesting stories. And they've been shaped in a certain way. So I'm asking you, in a sense, what would it look like this month for you to rethink some of that stuff? Find ways to talk about some of that stuff. In other words, I'm saying simply, tell us what it's like to be you. That's what I'm saying. I feel like I'm done. Take off your hat. Take off your hat to nothing known or unknown, or to any man or number of men. Go freely with powerful, uneducated persons, and with the young and with the mothers of families. Read these leaves in the open air every season of every year of your life. Re-examine all you have been told at school or church or in a book or in your own testimony. Dismiss whatever insults your own soul, and your very flesh shall be a great poem. And have the richest fluency, not only in its words, but in the silent lines of its lips and face, and between the lashes of your eyes, and in every motion and joint of your body, says Walt Whitman. Thanks for listening.